I finally reached the treehouse, the towering structure looming before me like a dark, silent sentinel. The icy wind howled through the branches above, and the air seemed heavier here, charged with something I couldn't quite place. My fingers trembled as I grasped the ladder. The rungs felt cold under my hands, the wood rough against my palms as I began to climb. With each step, my heart raced faster. What had Jake seen? Why had he reacted like that? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more bizarre than the last. But nothing seemed to fit. Why was he so eager to brush it off? Had he seen something? Or was there some other reason for his sudden change in demeanor? When I reached the top, I hesitated. The treehouse loomed in front of me, its small window reflecting the faint light of the moon. I reached for the door, the wood rough under my fingers, and pushed. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, as though it hadn't been used in a long time. I stepped inside, the cold air rushing in with me. The interior was dimly lit, dust motes dancing in the beam of my flashlight as I swept it around. The treehouse was cozy but worn. There was an old, faded rug on the floor, and a small, rickety wooden table sat in the corner. But what caught my attention was the chair. It was a large, worn armchair positioned directly in front of the small window, as if someone had once sat there, gazing out at the forest. But no one had been here for a long time. I shone my flashlight around the room again, the beam catching on something shiny against the far wall. A mirror. It was small, framed in dark wood, and oddly out of place. Something about it made me uneasy. The reflection in the glass was distorted, the edges warped, but there was something unsettling about it, a sense that the room behind me, reflected in the mirror, wasn't quite the same as the one I was standing in. I stepped closer to the mirror, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. My reflection looked different, faint, blurry, as if it wasn't really me at all. I shook my head, willing myself to stop imagining things. But the longer I stared at the reflection, the more I felt the sensation that something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt a deep sense of foreboding, a quiet unease crawling up my spine. Suddenly, the wind outside howled louder, rattling the walls of the treehouse. I jumped, my heart leaping in my chest. I spun around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the chair, the table, and the dust. I let out a shaky breath and glanced back at the mirror. The image was still there, blurry and strange, but now it seemed like it was moving, shifting in ways it shouldn't. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold chill settle over me, the kind that sinks deep into your bones. "Jake?" I whispered, my voice sounding far too loud in the stillness. No answer. I backed away from the mirror, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My mind raced. What was happening? I had to get out of there. I turned to leave, but then I froze. The ladder. It was gone. I blinked, staring at the empty space where the ladder had been just moments before. How had that happened? 1 second, I had been climbing up it, and now it was just gone. My heart hammered in my chest. Had Jake been right to be scared? Had something happened to the treehouse, something he wasn't telling me? I turned in a panic, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the room for another way down. There was nothing. No ladder, no exit, just the door behind me, which now looked impossibly far away. A low creak echoed through the treehouse. I froze, listening intently, my breath caught in my throat. The creaking grew louder, as though the very structure was shifting, groaning under some unseen weight. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The armchair in front of the window, was rocking. No one was sitting in it, but the chair was moving as if someone were gently rocking back and forth. lost in thought. My heart skipped a beat. I took a step backward, every fiber of my being screaming to run. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the chair. And then, a whisper, a soft, breathy sound that seemed to come from all around me. Leave. It was faint, but clear. The voice was distant, strained, as though the words had been dragged from somewhere deep within the earth itself. The air grew colder, and I shivered uncontrollably. I stumbled backward, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The door, no. I had to reach the door. But the moment I turned to run, something slammed into the wall behind me with a deafening bang. I whipped around, my breath coming in panicked gasps. But there was nothing. Nothing but the mirror, the chair, the cold silence. "Jake," I screamed, my voice breaking. But there was no answer. No reassuring sound from below. Just the wind, the creaking of the treehouse, and that voice. "Leave now," it whispered again, louder this time, more insistent. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it wanted. I had to get out. I had to. I spun on my heels and dashed toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a violent force. I gasped, my fingers numb as they gripped the door, shaking it in desperation. It wouldn't budge. In a panic, I backed away, my feet tangling in the rug as I fell to the floor with a thud. I scrambled to get up, my hands grasping at the cold wooden floor for support. The treehouse seemed to tilt, as if it was alive, shifting with every movement. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick, suffocating. My breath caught in my chest, and I gasped for air. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing just behind me, in the reflection of the mirror. It was a shadow at first, barely visible, but as I turned, it came into focus. A man. Tall, thin, his face obscured by darkness, but his eyes were glowing, an unnatural, eerie light. I froze. My blood ran cold. "Leave," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I turned, my scream caught in my throat as I found myself face to face with the figure. It reached out, its cold, skeletal hand brushing my cheek. And then everything went black. I awoke to the sound of Jake calling my name, his voice frantic, distant. My body ached, my head spinning, as I tried to push myself up. The treehouse was gone. I was lying on the ground beneath the towering pine, the snow around me untouched. I blinked, my eyes blurry. My heart thudded in my chest. Had I been dreaming? Had it all been a nightmare? I glanced around, but there was no treehouse. No ladder. No figure. Just the snow, the trees, and Jake, who was running toward me with a look of concern on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. "You were gone for hours." I stared at him, unsure whether to trust my own mind. Had it all been real? Or had it been a hallucination? A trick of the cold? I couldn't answer. The only thing I could hear was the wind and the whisper that still echoed in my mind. "Leave." When I finally reached the treehouse, I paused, leaning against the thick trunk of an ancient oak. My lungs burned with the cold air, each breath coming out in visible puffs. The treehouse loomed above me, dark and imposing against the winter sky, like something out of a nightmare. It had been years since I last set foot here, yet it still held the same unsettling presence. I shone my flashlight around the base, the beam flickering in the damp air, half expecting to find some clue as to why Jake had acted so strangely earlier. Why had he been so insistent that I stay away from this place? Why had he looked at me with such terror in his eyes when I mentioned the treehouse? But there was nothing unusual, just snow, rocks, and the sturdy wooden ladder leading up to the platform. Everything seemed too normal, but my gut told me otherwise. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the first rung of the ladder and began to climb. The ladder creaked under my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. It felt as though every movement echoed across the landscape, breaking the eerie quiet that surrounded me. The higher I climbed, the more the treehouse seemed to consume the night. It was like I was ascending into the darkness, drawn to something I couldn't fully comprehend. The view from up here was incredible, but it unsettled me. From this height, I could see the sprawling expanse of the property, the vast stretches of snow, and the twisted branches of trees bending beneath the weight of the winter. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the treehouse, partially obscured by shadows, was a wide, deep trough dug into the ground. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it might be some kind of old well or an abandoned hole in the earth, but something about it made my stomach churn. The coldness of the air seemed to grow thicker, suffocating even, as I scanned the area. I froze, my grip tightening on the ladder. From this height, I could see into the pit, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The trough wasn't empty. It was filled with bodies. Arms, legs, torsos, and skulls jutted out from the snow, a grotesque tangle of flesh and bone. Some of the corpses were fresh, their skin pale and waxy, still holding the shape of life despite the decay. Others had long since turned to skeletons, their brittle bones jutting out of the icy mound like the remnants of some forgotten battle. The sheer number of them was staggering. The stench hit me before I even realized I was breathing it in sharp, metallic, the scent of death that seemed to cling to every inch of the pit. My throat tightened, and a wave of nausea swept over me, my vision blurring at the edges. My stomach lurched, threatening to empty itself, but I clutched the ladder tightly, trying to steady myself. This wasn't just a grave. It was a dumping ground. Suddenly, the ladder beneath me groaned again, and before I knew what was happening, I lost my balance. My foot slipped, and the world tilted violently. The ladder swayed beneath me, creaking like it was going to snap under my weight. I panicked, flailing, trying to find my footing, but it was no use. I was falling, and all I could do was brace myself for the impact. But instead of crashing into the icy ground, I felt arms catch me. I looked up, my pulse racing, to find Jake standing there, his pale face drawn with concern, his eyes wide, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Fear? Jake! I gasped, my voice shaking with a mix of relief and dread. What the hell are you doing here? He set me down gently, his grip steady and reassuring. He didn't answer right away, his gaze flicking to the pit below us, his face growing even paler. For a moment, we both just stared at it, the unspoken horror settling between us like a heavy weight. I can explain, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Explain? I repeated, my voice trembling with disbelief. Explain what? Are you a killer? He looked at me, his expression pained. No, he said quickly, his voice cracking with urgency. It's not me. It's Martin. The words didn't make sense at first. Martin? Jake nodded, swallowing hard. His eyes were haunted, as though he'd been carrying this secret for far too long. He's a killer, a serial killer. My family, everyone knows. We've all known for years, but no one does anything. No one stops him. I stared at him in disbelief, the horror of his confession sinking in like ice water pouring down my spine. You've known this whole time? And you've done nothing? His face twisted with shame, and I could see the pain in his eyes. I thought it was over, he said, his voice breaking. I thought he'd stopped. I didn't want to believe it was still going on. Every word out of his mouth made my head spin. His family had been covering for Martin all these years, turning a blind eye to his atrocities. And Jake, the man I thought I loved, had been complicit, had allowed this to happen. I could feel the ground beneath me start to shift, my world tilting into a dizzying spiral of betrayal. You've got to be kidding me, I whispered, backing away from him. My body was shaking. The cold from the snow beneath me, nothing compared to the chill I felt in my bones. I don't know you anymore. I never wanted you to find out like this, Jake said, his voice pleading. I didn't want you involved. Please. But it was too much. I pushed past him, not caring about the icy ground beneath my feet or the darkness creeping in around us. I just needed to get away. I needed to escape this nightmare before it swallowed me whole. I ran toward the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the cold air biting at my skin. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting out of there, away from Jake, away from Martin, away from everything. Inside the cabin, I grabbed my phone and immediately started dialing 911. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 2 tries to unlock the screen, and I barely noticed the red glow of the numbers as they flashed across the screen. Wait! Jake's voice came from behind me, desperate, frantic. Before I knew what was happening, he snatched the phone from my hand, his grip tight and panicked. Please, he begged, his voice breaking. Just talk to Martin. Let him explain. Please. I stared at him, my heart racing, a whirlwind of emotions crashing through me. Are you insane? You want me to talk to a murderer? Jake's face was pale, but his eyes were pleading. Just hear him out. Then you can call the cops. I promise. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to run, but something in his voice, the desperation, the fear, made me freeze. Against my better judgment, I agreed. But I regretted it the moment I said it. Jake disappeared into the master bedroom, and for a moment, I thought he was calling his brother. But when he emerged, it wasn't with Martin. It was Jake himself, wearing a curly wig and an ill-fitting suit. What are you doing? I whispered, horrified, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake grinned awkwardly, an unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm Martin, he said in a low, unnatural voice, his tone almost mocking. I stared at him, my blood running cold. I felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me floating in an abyss of disbelief. Jake or Martin began talking, rambling about his hobby, about how his family helped him control his urges, about how they kept him from slipping. His words blurred together, barely registering in my mind as I tried to make sense of the twisted scene unfolding before me. I could barely keep my focus, my head spinning with panic, my chest tight with fear. But as he rambled on, something inside me snapped. I didn't want to hear any more. I didn't care about his twisted explanations. I was already backing away, inching toward the door. The moment I was far enough, I bolted. I ran for the car, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in gasps as I fumbled with the keys. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't care what Jake or Martin had to say. I didn't care about the lies, the twisted family secrets. I only cared about getting away from this nightmare. I drove away without looking back. That was the last time I ever dated a rich person. They're all insane. But at least I got to see snow,